Today we're going to talk about antacids. So if you look at the etymology of the word antacids, we see that it is derived from the Greek word anti meaning against and acidus from the Latin acidus meaning acid. So antacids are drugs which act against acid. So formally we could define antacids as weak bases that neutralize hydrochloric acid within the lumen of the stomach. So if this diagrammatically represents the stomach, then antacids are drugs which neutralize the acid which is present within the lumen. So by lumen we mean which is present inside the stomach. Okay. So usually antacids neutralize gastric acids. They neutralize by forming chlorides, water, and carbon dioxide. So let's look at examples. Let's say aluminum hydroxide. With hydrochloric acid forms aluminum chloride plus water. Okay, if we balance the equation, it would be 3. Okay, let's take another example. Let's take magnesium hydroxide. Okay, so that with HCl, again it forms magnesium chloride plus water. Let's balance this again. Right. Okay. So usually antacids are weak bases that neutralize hydrochloric acid by forming, as we see in these examples, by forming chlorides, water, and if it is sodium bicarbonate, then it forms carbon dioxide. Okay. And so these drugs, antacids, so we can write somewhere here, antacids. They decrease the concentration of hydrogen ion, okay, and thereby they increase the gastric pH. Okay, so antacids essentially do this. Okay, they decrease the concentration of the hydrogen ion, and thereby they increase the gastric pH. Okay, so here we see that they act chemically. Okay, the hydrochloric acid within the lumen of the stomach chemically interacts with the antacid aluminum hydroxide. Okay, so we can write by chemically interacting. With. Okay. So antacids decrease the concentration of the hydrogen ion, and in the process they increase gastric pH essentially by chemically interacting with the hydrogen ion. Okay. So we have said that um, in the definition that this neutralization occurs in the lumen of the stomach. So let's take a section of the stomach here and let's continue our discussion. Okay, so that section, I'm pasting this figure, that is essentially a section of that particular area of the stomach. Okay. And what we see is a crypt within the gastric mucosa. Okay. So we see that there is essentially a pit, and we see that there are different types of cells. So we see some cells called chief cells. Okay, there is chief cells, and there is parietal or oxyntic cells. Then there are mucous neck cells, and there are surface mucus cell. Okay. So let's see what these cells do. So the mucus, the chief cell secretes pepsinogen and renin. Okay, so this renin essentially in infants, not so much in the adults, but it does secrete pepsinogen in adults. The parietal or the oxyntic cells, these secrete hydrogen ion. Okay? So they are responsible for HCl. So let's write HCl. Okay? So they secrete HCl and something important called the intrinsic factor. Okay? So this intrinsic factor is needed for absorption of vitamin B12, okay, which is an essential vitamin. Okay? Right. Then we have these mucus cells. So these mucus cells, what do? As the name suggests, they secrete mucus. Okay? So let's take a section, a parietal cell, and blow it up here. Okay? So we're blowing up a parietal cell, and this essentially is what it looks like. Okay? So what is seen in the parietal cell is that this cell transports hydrogen ion, okay, and it takes in potassium ion, okay, by a pump which is called hydrogen potassium ATPase, okay? And that is called the proton pump, okay, because it pumps out H plus, and this H plus ultimately is what forms the HCl. Okay? So this is what happens in the parietal cell, and this is the lumen of the stomach. So into the lumen of the stomach, the H plus or the protons are secreted by the proton pump. Okay? So if we look at the parietal cell, we find that there are also other receptors in the parietal cell, and there are receptors for gastrin, there are receptors for acetylcholine, which we abbreviate ACH, acetylcholine, and then there are receptors for histamine, okay, and prostaglandin. So what these receptors do is, these receptors, they stimulate the formation of cyclic AMP, and the cyclic AMP stimulates the proton pump. Meaning if there is gastrin, for example, there is a gastrinoma. Gastrinoma is presence of lots of this gastrin gastrin cells. So somewhere hidden among these cells are G cells. Okay. So G cells. So these G cells secrete gastrin. Okay. And this gastrin acts on the gastrin receptor. So there is a gastrinoma where there are many number of G cells, and increased presence of these G cells, we call it by a syndrome called Zollinger-Ellison syndrome. Okay, essentially, ZE syndrome is a gastrinoma, meaning there is increased uh, production of gastrin. Okay? And this increased production of gastrin acts on the gastrin receptor, and essentially it increases the secretion of protons. Okay? Stimulation by acetylcholine also increases cyclic AMP, and it increases the activation of the proton pump, and that in turn increases HCl. Histamine likewise. Okay? Prostaglandin, on the other hand, decreases the activity of the proton pump. Okay? So if we look at this cartoon of the parietal cell, we understand that there are lots of other things that can stimulate the proton pump. Okay? Um, but so you can maybe block the acetylcholine receptor here, and thereby you can reduce the secretion of proton. Similarly, you can block the histamine receptor and decrease the protons that are formed. Okay? But what we see here is that if we block these receptors, we are essentially blocking receptors. Okay, blocking receptors to decrease the proton secretion, the concentration of protons. But we are blocking the secretion by blocking receptors. Okay? But how did we define antacids? We said antacids are weak bases that act neutralize the hydrochloric acid by a chemical reaction. Okay? So there is no receptor involved. So antacids, by definition, they act chemically. They don't act via receptors. Okay? So therefore, anticholinergic drugs or antihistaminic drugs, they are not called antacids. Okay? So antacids are drugs which chemically interact with H plus and decrease the concentration of H plus and increase the gastric pH. Okay? But we understand that we can, essentially block the proton pump. That will reduce H plus. We can block the cholinergic receptor. We can block the histaminic receptor, and thereby we can reduce the acid formation. Okay? But those drugs which act via receptors, they are not called antacids. Okay? Though they have the same function. Okay? Okay. So now we have defined what antacids are.